tonight is an exciting topic, which is 2020 Pixel Survey Report and what we can do about it. Bill Porter, you've got the floor.
All right. Well, first, I realized I should have added one slide in the beginning just this moment, which is just to, tell people what we did. And basically, we're presenting on facts, or not facts, we're presenting on data that was collected via a Google Forms survey that we ran for a few months starting back in December. So just to clarify that for anyone that just showed up and didn't know what this is about, that's what this is about. Who am I to be talking right now? My name is Bill Porter. I'm an electrical engineer for the U.S. Navy. I've been working for the Navy for the past 11 years. I specialize in embedded design, system engineering, power systems, controls, robotics, that sort of thing. I've had to design systems, and then I've had to go support and figure out why my systems fail. So that's sort of the experience I've had. Now I'm gonna say we a couple times. When I say who are we, this idea was originally hatched out of the official xSlides vendor group admins, who are myself, Kevin, Chris, and Jonathan. It was actually Kevin's idea to start collecting the data, and I sort of took the lead on ways that I thought we could do it in a fair and as scientifically possible a way that we could do it. One of the guys in the vendor group proved to be very helpful in this because he apparently has a bachelor in science in fire science and worked as a fire investigator, and that's Chris. So Chris was very helpful, talking to a lot about the stuff we learned and the pictures we looked at. I forget the guy's name who introduced me to him, but I did talk to an epoxy expert. His name was Joey Spendlove. So obviously we're going to be talking about epoxy a little later on. And I want to say special thanks to Keith Wesley, Daryl Collins, Brian Rudy, John Spiker, Russell McFarland, Jim Gray, a bunch more names that I'm forgetting. And of course, everyone that took the survey. These guys all helped me in different ways. They were sounding boards for some of the ideas, and they helped review my presentations some nights as well. I want to specify I have no financial stake with any vendor. However, I am friends with multiple vendors. And what I mean is, when we go to these events like the expos, I will drink socially with lots of people. And some of those people I will drink with are vendors. So just as a disclaimer, yes, if anyone finds a picture of me hanging out with a vendor, I hung out with everyone that I thought was cool at events like Expo and the Florida Mini and things like that. Why do we do this? Failure rates in fires appeared to be a large problem this year being 2020, more so than usual. Some people will think that's not the case, but one thing is certain, there was a lot more talk about failures this year being 2020. We saw lots of scary pictures of fires, lots of discussion of what was causing them. I saw a lot of people jumping to conclusions. I saw a lot of theories that had technical problems. And I saw a lot of people that were blaming users right off the bat and asking what, could it be user error? I felt some of this needed to be addressed. What we looked to collect, we were only asking people who had failures to fill out the survey. We were trying to see if we could find trends or patterns with the failures with the people that actually had them to see if we can come to a clue for the cause. We were asking, can we prove or disprove some theories with the data? The person whose idea it was to start this actually thought, were pixel pushers causing the failure? And I don't actually mention it in the slides because it wasn't significant, but it was an overwhelming no, because I think like 90% of people that took the survey said they did not use pixel pushers. All right, so there's extremely strong evidence it's not people damaging pixels with pixel pushers, as an example. What we didn't want to collect, well, we couldn't possibly quantify the entire pixel community. That would require us making sure that everyone took a survey to be able to make claims that require capturing the entire community. That's almost possible. We also didn't want to collect vendor bashing. So what I did was, the best of my abilities, I saw that in Google Forms you can require a Google sign-in, and then each account can only submit one survey entry. So we were trying to use that to prevent ballot box stuffing if anyone felt the need to spend an afternoon trying to falsify data. We are only going to reveal the vendors that showed a statistical difference from the rest. So we're not going to list every vendor that was stated. We're only listing the vendors that were statistically significant. Ooh, that's a mouthful. And who we've actually went out and talked to. What does that mean? That means and these are examples. I'm going to say this like 3 times. These are examples. We could say things like all reported fires had rainbow colored epoxy, or all high failure rate pixels were triangle shaped pixels. Yes, those are ridiculous on purpose because one of my reviewers said, make it ridiculous or else people think this is actual data. This is not data, this is an example. I'm illustrating a point. So if that's our example, things we can't say about that example is we can't say what % of rainbow colored epoxy pixels sold end up catching fire, because that would require capturing the entire community. We can't say when the rainbow colored epoxy pixels were made or sold. We can't say the percentage of good or bad pixels sold by any vendor, and we can't say if the customer is satisfied with the vendor's response. We purposely did not ask survey entries to list if they felt satisfied with the vendor. I wasn't really wanting to get in the game of moderating vendor reviews. I just was trying to look for people giving us the data of their pixels so we can try to put some pieces together. So that's an example of what we can say and what we can't say. But there is some common sense to this. Millions upon millions of pixels have been made with no issues. Any vendor can end up selling a bad batch of pixels, and that doesn't mean previous or future batches will be bad as well. We're going to get to this in a bit. We only had 102 usable server results, means that the failure rate is very low compared to sales, or our sample size is very low, and that also has some implications for how trustworthy the data is with this low sample size. There's really no way to tell if we captured all the failures and there were low failures, or if we didn't capture all the failures. Everyone in this hobby should expect some failures. I'll talk about this in a minute, but 1 or 2 pixels failing a year should be normal. I've talked to some vendors that have had customers that are upset with 1 pixel failing, and I kind of want to make clear some failures are normal. So the real goal of our survey was to motivate vendors to be more open when they are aware of manufacturing issues caught after the sales, because it's only a vendor that could tell us if it's affected or who is affected, when they were sold, what the problem was, etc. I also have a goal of this presentation to turn everyone here into a better educated consumer, and I'm going to do that by busting some myths and I'm going to make a plea to promote some healthier online discussions. Oh my goodness, you guys are killing me. I guess I shouldn't use rainbow colored epoxy. To be super clear, I will be presenting data collected through the survey. I will be presenting the response from the 2 vendors who were shown a summary of this data already. I will be giving my expert opinion on what I believe the data shows. This includes knowledge gained in consulting with the epoxy vendor and the fire analysis expert. I can be wrong. That opinion is given under the assumption that the survey was answered honestly. I think it was. I don't think there was malicious people that took it. I think people were just frustrated and took it because they were hoping to get some result out of it. I'm going to hope that humans are generally trustworthy. I will be correcting some theories I've seen with engineering analysis as well. I did some examples. We'll talk about engineers, things like that, because I am one. So let's dive right into it before I lose my voice. We had 129 people take the survey. I had to go through and I had to throw some of those out. Some of the reasons I had to throw them out, they didn't report any failures. Some people just felt the need to tell me that they didn't have any failures. Or they reported failures that were like a subcolor of a pixel was bad, but the pixel still passed data. And I do not count that as a pixel failure. That's sort of just normal, rules of our hobby, that sometimes you get a pixel that doesn't show the right color. 9 reported a failure that I felt was unreasonably low, like below 0.1%. 5, what they told us in the boxes or what they checked were just unclear, conflicting information. I couldn't really make sense of it. And 8 selected multiple vendors of multiple types, but didn't use the box to break down what types go with what vendors so that we could be fair to assign that data to that vendor correctly. I need to stop reading the chat. I'm paying extra for rainbow. Anyway, 102 entries left to consider after you deduct these that we are discounted. Hi, Scott. So as we started looking at the data, we discovered that the data became 2 distinct subsets that were distinct from each other when looked at 2 different ways. Fire/charring and dead pixels had 2 fairly unique data sets when separated. So we're going to discuss those 2 as 2 separate failure modes in a minute. I'm going to close the chat. So just looking at overall, what did we get in the survey? We got 102 survey entries. 71% were dead pixels. So that orange blob is dead pixels. 18% fires, 11% charring. So orange is dead, yellow is fires, blue is charring. blue-gray. The fire charring data sets looked very similar when separate, so we were combining them into one thermal event because I believe it's one thermal event, but just the result of the event differs based on engineering stuff we're going to talk about later. So that was the overall server results there for what types of failures. So we're going to jump right into fires and charring, and I'm going to beg you guys, stay with me for the next 45 minutes. Let's not jump to hating on anybody, jump to conclusions. Follow me all the way through this. Let me speak everything I want to speak, and then afterwards we can discuss it. Someone just asked, what about melting? Some people didn't pick charring or fired and they wrote in melting. I still changed that to charring, because in my mind, charring and melting is still something getting very hot. Either it's hot enough to melt it or it's hot enough to actually brown it. So fires and charring. Of the fires and charring reported, 85% were bought from Raywu. The 15% remaining were split across four other vendors, each no more than 5% individually. So this is a huge statistical anomaly. This is large enough margin to draw some conclusions, is my argument. To repeat, Ray has made millions of good pixels for many years. That doesn't mean you can't have a bad batch once or twice. I can't tell you when that batch is sold with any acceptable precision. We email them and I will show the response. I will not saying don't buy from Ray. However, if you're concerned, I advise you contact him with your concerns first. And we're going to deep dive further into this. So the pixel types of Ray's fires / charring, 68% were round or bullet. Round or bullet, the same thing. People just call them different words. And 32% were square. I'm talking to a couple of vendors. Round generally outsells square by a lot. So to me, this is not statistically significant in any way. They both seem affected. Of the fires charring of Ray's pixels reported, 60% were 12-volt regulated. 60% were 12-volt unsure, 16% were 12-volt resistor, 8% were 5-volt. When we look at the other data set, I'm going to make an argument that the other data set is more representative of the community at large. This one is not. I'd argue, and some vendors have told me it's a good argument, there are more resistor regulators in the field than there are regulated. So the fact that we see regulated a bigger chunk here when really there's more resistor than regulated means this is probably a regulated problem. It's only affecting majorly regulated pixels. That 12%, that 60% unsure, that could go either way. That 60% could be added to the 60 and make it much more significant. It could be split up, it could be added to resistor. Those are just people that didn't know how to tell what kind of pixels they had. To be clear, many vendors have been selling regulated pixels for years without issue. Ray has been selling regulated pixels for years. There's nothing inherent to the design of a regulated pixel that makes them more likely to catch fire. We'll talk about that in a minute. So I believe the correct conclusion is I believe Ray sold a batch of regulated pixels with defective regulators. I'm going to make that argument here in a bit. But one more time, do not be afraid of regulated pixels. People use them because they produce more consistent color and can run longer without power injection. They do not get hotter than resistive pixels. And we'll talk about that later. We did contact Raywu. In the email, I gave him this data, and this is a cut and copy paste of his response. Most of my customers are smaller ones. Also, many of them buy from my AliExpress store directly. I sold more than 6.5 million pixels in 2020, so I guess that is the reason why it seems my pixels were a higher percentage. The regulated pixels have a higher failure rate than the resistor type because the regulated ones were designed with a 78 LO5 regulator, I'm going to assume, which makes the whole pixel to be 0.65 watts when at full white, so much more heat than the resistor. Also, the regulated pixels are with more components than resistor ones. Hey, is someone not muted? Because I'm hearing noise. Here's my thoughts to that response. His first argument, to me, he's kind of making, I sell the most, and therefore I'm the most because I sell the most. The results were 85% Ray and 5% the next largest vendor, and that's too significant to explain away the sales volume difference. I tried to see if I could get a little bit more data to kind of put that in perspective. And I asked several vendors if they were willing to share their 2020 sales volume as a comparison. Most declined. One responded that they would tell me as long as I kept them anonymous, and their sales volume was 4.4 million. So Ray's 6.2 to this guy's 4.4. That means Ray really doesn't sell that much more, at least not 10 times more, which would be required to explain why he was the most prevalent in this category. Again, you have to be honest that Ray and the other vendor are being honest with me about those sales volume numbers. So to me, this kind of disproves that argument that he's only statistically significant because he sells the most. He may sell the most, but not enough, not 5% to 85%. It's not tenfold more than any other vendor, as evidenced by the other vendor's 4.4 million. So to me, that doesn't really explain that away. His second point about the power argument, I quite don't understand. The LED and the driver chip are what sets the power draw of the pixel. It's actually defined in the spec sheet of the pixel controller itself. All pixels are about 50 milliamp or 0.25 watts. Full white. 12 volt pixels must dissipate another 12 volt pixels must dissipate another 0.35 watts as heat. This is the same power that has to be dissipated whether through a resistor or regulator. All pixels are basically 5 volt. All 12 volt pixels have to take 12 volts and make it 5 volt. They all do it by converting the extra voltage to heat. Regulator pixels do it through a regulator. Resistor pixels do resistors. So I'm assuming Ray's 0.65 watt comment must have been him talking about this extra dissipation. But again, resistor pixels have to do this too. They aren't magic. Both of the drop 12 volts to 5 volts, so I don't understand this part of his response. I believe that these were just defective regulators that failed to a high impedance short, heated up, and in some cases caught fire. There's an alternative theory that this could be an epoxy failure that led to corrosion across the power leads on a regulator that shorted and heated up to a fire. We will discuss epoxy failures in a minute because we did have epoxy failures. If that is the case, there could be a thought that resistor pixels may not have a place in the circuit board where 12 volt and ground are close, like they are next to a regulator. So it's harder to form a shorting corrosion. It's harder to form shorting corrosion at distance, which explains why they wouldn't have failed as much. One of the most telling, I don't want to say proof, but you're about to see a video that I think is very interesting because someone caught a fire happening in real time. And this is an amazing video. So this is this video. Let's see if I can play it. There we go. So here's someone who submitted this video because they caught their pixel burning in real time. Now I froze this frame and put it on the right because I believe this guy's a little bit anal. And I think he made sure all his pixels were turned the same way on each column. And if you note, the pixel above the burning pixel, that's the regulator the arrow is pointing to. So if you move your view down 1 pixel and look through that hole to see what device is red hot, that would be the regulator that is red hot. So this is an amazing video because it's literally catching a regulator heating up to the point where it's glowing red. But it's also something interesting because the pixel did not catch fire. The epoxy did not light off. Basically, the regulator got hot enough to melt a hole through the epoxy, but not hot enough to actually ignite the epoxy to the point where it was self-consuming the epoxy. So this guy was lucky to have caught this fire, and it didn't actually turn into a full fire. It was just a regulator glowing hot, burning a hole through the side of the pixel. I think I'm just gonna let it play one more time and take a drink because it's pretty awesome. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Something interesting, what we saw is something interesting. We had lots of submitted pictures of fires where it's evident that the entire pixel was not consumed. The epoxy did not light off. I actually, with Chris on Zoom, set fire to some pixels in my garage with a blowtorch. If you can get the epoxy to ignite, there's nothing left after the fire. The whole thing turns to ash. These pixels are what people submitted, everything except this one on the lower right. This one right here, I'd argue, actually caught the epoxy on fire because there's no more epoxy left. The other pixels clearly just burned a hole out the side of the pixel. And it's hard, because the pixel gets damaged enough, it's really hard to tell if that's where the regulator is, but I think it is. I think that's the regulator in the square pixel in the upper right that you can sort of see. I think all these spots should line up where the regulator is in the board for the fire coming out. And to be clear, the best part of the data we collected from the survey was people who had already done these investigations. We got a lot of good photos, we got a lot of good videos, we got a lot of theories from those people, and that really enabled us to draw conclusions without doing a lot of investigation on our own. Someone just posted about rain. We did have a question in the survey to ask about water, and it was not conclusive from what we could tell from the responses. All right, let's jump into myth busting. I had some people ask me, why did we not collect brightness settings in the survey? Well, first off, before we even started the survey, people had submitted videos and photos of fires starting in the middle of the day when the pixels were off but still energized. During show conditions, pixels are off more than they are on. If you pick any pixel in your show and just stare at it and play your sequences, they're probably off more than they're on. And when they are on, they're usually one or two primary colors. They're not white. I'd also argue that most people who use 12 volt with long runs are only doing so by going lower in brightness. So my argument is any failure analysis that is made with the worst case, aka 100% white for long duration, is flawed, as these are very rare conditions in practice. So if you're trying to put an argument together for a failure mode that requires worst case for a while, that's not a good argument because that's not what we do in our shows. This is also why I have an issue with Ray's response about power, because people aren't pushing 0.65 watts to their pixels all the time. On average, they're doing much less than that. Even still, a pixel that can't run continuously at 100% white is a defective pixel in my book. We shouldn't have to baby them. Myth busting number 2, and I've seen a couple people with this attitude, and I call it the anti-Ron Howard. Does lack of power injection contribute to fires? No. Wires are not perfect conductors. Really, wires are long resistors. Due to physics / wire impedance and the low voltage we use, you can't really overload a string of pixels with too many pixels on it. And that's because pixels will consume less current once the voltage they see has dropped by about 6 volts, depending on pixel type. Any potential weak points in the wire or circuit board add resistance that causes the voltage to drop sooner, that causes less pixels on the string to draw full current. It's sort of like a self-feedback system. The effect goes away when you use higher voltage, 24 volts, 36 volts, etc. Then you have more voltage to cause problems. This is also why you could cause problems with 120 volt AC lights, because now that voltage is high enough that you could cause problems with too many lights plugged in together. And to sort of illustrate that example, here's 100 pixels on full white drawing 4.6 amps. If I tack on another 200 pixels, theoretically it should be drawing over 8 amps, but it only goes up 0.2 amps in reality. That's because there's no longer enough voltage due to voltage drop to keep feeding those pixels. And that's also an interesting number. Notice most of our controllers have a 5 amp fuse in them. And just by the nature of our pixel wire, we can't seem to pull more than 5 amps no matter how many pixels we plug into each other without power injection. Power injection changes that. With no power injection, we seem to hit an upper limit of about 5 amps, no matter how many pixels we start plugging in together. So that's sort of diffusing. Does the lack of power injection contribute to fires? A lack of power injection just means you're more likely to get pink pixels. You're not going to have fires due to bad design because you didn't use power injection. Ron Howard's house is safe. Myth busting number 3. Correct fusing should have prevented this, right? Well, no, sorry. Like before, wire resistance somewhat regulates what can be fed into a fault. In order to get one spot hot enough to start a fire, it needs something. It needs resistance itself. Dead shorts don't get very hot themselves because they are low resistance. So there's a balance. You need just the right amount of resistance with the right place in a string to get enough energy into a fault to start a fire. Too close to the front of the string, next to the power supply, then you could actually build a fuse, yes. Too far at the end, then there's not enough power that can be fed into the fault, and you just get a hot pixel, maybe some charring. So somewhere in the middle, there's a sweet spot range where you can get enough current into a fault through those wires to start a fire without blowing your fuses. The fuses actually don't protect from fires. Sorry, guys. Here's an example. I created a pigtail that was a dead short, tied the power wires together the best I could, made a good connection. If I stuck that dead short pigtail at the end of 100 pixels and a 10-foot lead wire, I'm only drawing 4 amps out of my power supply. So a dead short after 100 pixels won't even blow a 5 amp fuse. And that's a dead short. What I'm trying to reinforce here is that there's other things at play, and wires aren't perfect conductors. Wires can limit what gets fed down the string themselves. So in this example, the wires of this pixel string itself is limiting the current that can be fed into a dead short. And this dead short after 100 pixels would not blow my fuse. You go further, you put the dead short at 200 pixels, now it drops to 2.8 amps. So now the further away you're getting from your power supply down the line of pixels, the less power you draw in a dead short condition. So both of these dead shorts wouldn't even blow in my 5 amp fuses in my pixel controller. But Bill, where's that power going? Yes, as John D says, that doesn't mean don't fuse, because you could have a dead short against your pixel controller. And if you've not fused and you have a dead short against your pixel controller becomes your fuse. So yes, absolutely, John, I need to be reinforced, you need to fuse, but fuses don't stop fires. They can stop some problems, not all problems. So where's the power going when it's only drawing 4 amps? Well, the power is going into creating a big heater out of the entire string of pixels. So that's a thermal camera. You'll notice that the front little cluster of pixels along that 100 pixel strand has gotten up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And the dead short itself has barely gotten hot at all. So the end of the string where the dead short exists, where 12 volt is shorted to ground, has only gotten to 87 degrees, but along the string itself, where some of the pixels are, have gotten to 100 degrees. So this is the case where we're dissipating all the power over a wide area, so that wide area doesn't get very hot. What we need to start a fire is we need to get a lot of power into a little area. So how do we get a lot of power into a little area? You need the right amount of resistance at the right place. Now, everyone talked to me about how I could demonstrate what, trying to control or start a pixel fire. I can't predict what pixel is going to be the next one to fail, but there is a good analogy for what the kind of failure we need. And that good analogy, if anyone is in the model rocket business, they know what this thing is. This is a model rocket igniter. This is a cool little device. It's got 2 little wires. You basically hook it up to a little box with a 9-volt battery and a button, and it causes the model rocket to explode, to fire off. You'll notice in the specifications, it specifies a resistance. It says this igniter's resistance is 1.6 ohms. Because like I said, in order to get a fire, we need the right amount of resistance in the right place. This is on purpose a manufactured right amount of resistance in a little bit of area, because this is a case where we want to start a fire. Hold on, I take a break and get burning. So, in our last example, dead short, no fires. Also, no fuses blown, unfortunately. Here is 100 pixels again with the model rocket igniter at the end of the 100 pixels. So we're going to feed this power, same amount of voltage, through the same 10-foot leader plus 100 pixels, but this time instead of a dead short, I've added that model rocket igniter. So we went from nearly 0 ohms to 1.8 ohms. And take a look at the difference a little bit of resistance makes. This is in slow motion, by the way, sorry for the strobing. So just by having the right amount of resistance in a small area in the right place, we went from, don't blow your fuse, don't cause anything, to we start a fire. Oh, I guess I'll play it again. Why not? Let's watch more fires since we're talking about them. Now it's a party. I agree. Let's move on. Myth busting number 4. Are 5-volt pictures less prone to fire? Yes, let's start the voltage wars, because why not? The answer is yes, / needs context. The same effect with physics as the last slide. The sooner you lose voltage, the less current you draw, applies here. And there's also another equation that comes into play. That equation is power equals voltage squared over resistance. That's the equation for the power you can feed into a fault increases exponentially with increased voltage fed into the fault. However, power injection makes this complicated. A fault close to a power injection point could still cause a fire even with 5 volts, because then there's less wire resistance between the power supply and the fault, means less voltage drop. So the correct statement is 5 volts can still catch fire depending on conditions. However, it is less likely. And for those that just glazed over, let me give a demonstration of that equation. If we have a 2 ohm fault, And I used 2 ohms because this model rocket igniter was 1.8 ohms. So it's pretty close to what the model rocket igniter was. You use the equation power equals voltage squared over resistance. A 12-volt string can feed 72 watts into that fault. A 5-volt string can feed 12.5 watts into that fault. So let me ask you, which of those can get hotter, aka which is the bigger number by far? So again, the correct statement is 5 volts can still catch fire depending on conditions. However, it is less likely. Okay. Why were the fires different? Why did we have, full-on failure that was unfortunately something we saw with Spiker? Or why do we have a lot of those pictures that were just holes that popped out of the pixel? Well, where on the pixel string the fault happens defines how much power is fed into it via all the things we just saw. Distance from the power supply defines how much power can be fed into it. All the list goes on for all the different parameters around trying to quantify why some fires are worse than others. So to get the worst kind of fire, you need the maximum amount of power you can, plus a little bit of oxygen to get the epoxy to ignite. So I'm going to call this the John Spiker luck factor. Here's the fault tree that we're going to walk down that is now named after John Spiker. Do your pixels have a faulty regulator? If yes, does that pixel exist in the sweet spot along the string? If yes, does the failing regulator get hot enough to ignite the epoxy? Remember, that means the right amount of resistance in the right place to get the right amount of power, to get the right amount of heat to ignite that epoxy. If yes, does the epoxy fire get hot enough to ignite the chloroplast? If yes, is your roof flammable? The only person I don't know of so far that answered yes to all those 5 of those is Spiker. That's why that's the John Spiker failure tree. I'd also argue a large percentage of the fire failures stop at 2 or 3, as evidenced by the videos and the pictures of the pixels we saw charred but not bursting or open pixels, or if they opened up, they didn't fully engulf the epoxy. So this is my long attempt to explain all the different factors at play that govern how lucky or unlucky you are when you have a failure. So to wrap this up, survey shows strong evidence of a bad batch of 12-volt regulated pixels from Ray. Ray claims the regulators somehow burn more power than resistors and that he outsells the most, yet he sells the largest quantity to explain his large percentage of survey responses. Many pixel fires can't be prevented with proper fusing or testing. Sorry, guys. Adding power injection changes the chances somewhat of a full fire versus a charred fire pixel, but it does not cause or prevent it. What does play a big part is luck. That plays a big part in how bad it gets if you have defective pixels. So that's the end of fire. Any real questions? I don't think I see any. There's a lot of talk.
Yes. Can you explain their second to last bullet point? Adding power injection changes the chances, but which way, up or down? Does power injection lead towards full fire, or does power injection lead towards charred pixel?
Adding power injection could change it to be slightly more likely that it's a full fire. Because when we talk about the sweet spot or the sweet zone along the pixel strand where you get maximum heat, as you add power injection points, you're adding more sweet zones. So it's not a lot. It's just one of those things where I have to say it's technically adding, but to be honest, it's such a marginal effect. Because if you're actually going to do a analysis of someone who did no power injection versus someone who did power injection, the people that didn't do power injection are going to have multiple strands, each with their own connection to the power supply. The person that didn't do it are going to have power injection points. So thinking about it again, maybe I shouldn't even say it does somewhat increase it, but it's such a small percent, it's not even worth talking about, if that makes sense. So I don't know why I talked about it, but I did. Oh well. All right, moving forward. Anybody? All right, moving forward. Dead pixels. Well, I'm a stickler for terminology, so let's clarify the term dead pixels. Right after I take a sip of this drink. Any pair of pixels that stops passing data is a dead pixel. We are never sure if it's the last working one not sending the data or the first dark one having other issues, but in total there's one dead pixel there. Remember, we did not count people describing loss.
Bill, stop for a second. Your presentation went away.
Oh, interesting. I also had an orange light somewhere on my Zoom window for some reason. Is it working now?
Yes, you're back.
Computer caught fire. So remember, we do not count people losing a loss of a subcolor, but an otherwise working pixel that passes data as a dead pixel. These are pixels that we hate because they literally make the rest of the prop dark. Okay, we're more than halfway through. All right. Oh. Oh, come on. PowerPoint's not working. So of people that reported dead pixels, here's the distribution between the vendors. 50% were Ray, 23% were RGB Man, and 7% were Paul. The remaining 20% are split across 7 other vendors with no one vendor over 5%. So obviously right here is orange, RGB Man is that bluish color, and the first large dark grayer one is Paul. We contacted RGB Man, and I asked them the question everyone already told me is Paul the supplier of his pixels, and am I allowed to say it? And he said, yes, you can say it, and Paul is the supplier of my pixels. So what we did is we combined Paul's and RGB Man's, and that changes to a 30% chunk of the response, which is significant. Why RGB Man is higher than Paul, maybe it's the Facebook bias. RGB Man does a lot of business on Facebook. This survey was advertised on Facebook, so we captured probably mostly Facebook people and not other people. So let's combine RGB Man and Paul, and now the pie looks like this. Sorry for the color changes, but Ed's theme messed with all my pie colors, and I already made this a screenshot, so it didn't change with the theme. Thanks, Ed. Remaining 20% is split across 7 other vendors, no one vendor over 5%. Of the dead pixels reported, here's the distribution of pixel type. 45% 12-volt resistor, 27% 12-volt regulated, 70% 12-volt unknown, 10% 5-volt. 79% round, 21% square. Round, remember, round is bullet, depending on what word you like to use. I've showed this to a couple people. We all agree this is probably a good sampling of what just normal distribution is in the community. AKA, there's more resistor out in the wild. There is some regulated, and altogether there's a lot more 12-volt than there is 5-volt. A lot of people agree this just shows the normal distribution of what's in the wild. So that means none of this plays a factor, but it has to be something that's common to all of these. So what is common to all these types of pixels that isn't voltage or shape? Housing, epoxy, soldering? Well, we didn't have to wait long because you guys already figured this out, because we got a ton of pictures and reports of people saying it's epoxy. We got lots of cracked epoxy. We have other epoxy problems. We see rust under our pixels. It's something to do with epoxy. Can we say that's the only issue? No. I had some people write in that they thought they had bad solder joints. You know, they sent 1 or 2 pictures of what they thought was a bad solder joint. And that's hard to prove, but yeah, I could kind of agree that picture did look like it. One person showed me that they could literally flex their pixel and it would work and not work depending on flexing the pixel. That could be another issue, but that's one of those issues that would be really hard to track or prove. But epoxy is easy to prove because holy crap, we got a ton of these pictures. Pictures with cracks already showing rust underneath the cracks, showing water ingress. Pictures of cracks like in that bullet at the top, where as soon as they peeled off the rubber, that the epoxy just fell apart, like the rubber around the pixel was the only thing holding the epoxy together. We had one, unfortunately, I couldn't find the video in my folder of all the stuff submitted, but someone actually sent us a video where they, all in one cut, pulled out a box of pixels, found the ones that looked cracked, put a tape on the string next to them, laid them out on the sidewalk, and then used a hair bottle water sprayer and sprayed them while they were in a test mode. And within 5 minutes, they started flickering. That was Troy. Thank you for that video, Troy. I couldn't find it. It's a great video. He did a good job investigating it. I think it's a nice smoking gun I can literally show you a cracked pixel and literally spray it with water and then it starts flickering. Great video. I may have been doing this presentation up to about 10 minutes ago, Troy, so I didn't have time to go hunt your video down, but it was a good video. Just looking at the vendors of cracked pixels, only 30% of responses total reported that they noticed cracked pixels. 69% were Ray Wu, only 17% were RGB Man and Paul. And at this point, I was tired of making pie charts, so I didn't make a pie chart. So someone just look at the percentages and visualize it, because I was done with the pie charts at this point. I was running out of pie charts theme. There was also a secondary epoxy issue that we saw. And it was one that I actually started finding in a small group of people, and I started expanding to asking more and more people if they had it. It was very soft epoxy. A lot of people that had bought Raywu pixels for many years would pick out an old pixel, take off the rubber, and the epoxy was hard as a rock. You couldn't even hit it with a hammer, and it wouldn't even dent. It wasn't going anywhere. But when they took out a pixel from 2020, and with very little effort and needle nose pliers, they were able to peel the epoxy off, and it was the consistency of gummy bears. So they were describing it to me as the epoxy was the consistency of gummy bears. And this was actually pictures that Keith took, so thank you for that, Keith. But it's a good indication of what we saw. So what we could say is there was a change in the epoxy that was soft. What we're not sure of, because we can't make that correlation equals causation argument, we're not sure if that actually causes failures or not. And my pixel expert couldn't tell me that either. All we can say is we found out that pixels in 2020 tended to have soft epoxy, and pixels before that did not. Okay. Ray's response. Ray said, I did have a bad batch of epoxy resin last year, which caused the pixels cracked after several months and water came in. But I think it was only one bad batch of them actually. I had sent many replacements to customers. I now use another resin supplier with higher and much stable quality. The issue will not happen again. So Ray's acknowledging he had an epoxy problem. RGB Man response. RGB Man, we had a long phone call, so I'm kind of having to summarize what we talked about on the phone a bit here. His quote was more or less, once we started getting feedback with customers reporting epoxy problems, Paul shut down his line for a week and fixed the issue. I also believe that there were some QC issues related to COVID shutdown that affected the parts and quality. Now that things have settled down and the epoxy filling machine fixed, things have returned to normal. Any of all my customers that had high failure rates should contact me if they feel the issue was not resolved. So now we have both Ray and Paul acknowledging some sort of epoxy issue last year. So that sort of confirms what the survey collected was, that we had an epoxy issue. And I'm glad the vendors were open with saying, yes, we had an epoxy issue. It's a very small quantity, and we think we've taken care of our customers. Why do we care about the epoxy? Epoxy is what seals the circuit board, the wire, the connection, and the components from water. And water equals bad for electronics. Great for drinking, especially if you add some hops, bad for electronics. All these failures, if related to the epoxy, means the epoxy failed and let water get in, caused corrosion, or disrupted the operation of the pixel. If you don't need rainwater to get water, you don't need rain to get water either. It's literally in the air too. Notes from talking to my epoxy expert. Some of the points he was trying to make to me is picking the right epoxy is a very difficult task. Epoxy, the different types of epoxies have different abilities to bond to different surfaces. And when you have an assembly like a pixel, you have to pick a special epoxy that bonds to all three surfaces. It has to bond to the wire jacket, the jackets of the wires to make a seal. It has to bond to the rubber, and it has to bond to the circuit board and the parts on the circuit board to seal them. So picking the correct epoxy to bond against all three surfaces, that's something that's actually pretty hard. When asked about the soft epoxy, he said it could be bad materials used, expired material, or incorrect ratio of hardener. He offered that there could be other materials that you could use in an assembly like a pixel that isn't epoxy and would be soft. But he was telling me that they're more likely to be more expensive than epoxy, so he wouldn't see how pixels getting cheaper would switch to a more expensive material than epoxy. He also didn't give me a metric, but he did say fire-resistant epoxy is much, much more expensive. And what was amazing about his phone call was in the first minute, before I even got very deep at all, I explained who I was, what the hobby was, and I was calling about what I believe may be the China effect. And he stopped me and he goes, oh, let me tell you about my industry. In my industry, all the epoxy comes from China. And it's only a couple factories. And we literally have to babysit our factory, because if we don't, they will try to switch materials on us and give us inferior stuff. So we literally pay someone to sit there and babysit our factory to make sure they continue to use the same quality parts in all our projects. And I was laughing out loud because we're going to talk about that a little later. I was like, that's exactly what an argument I'm going to make a little bit later about some of our vendors. Other theories for dead pixels. Like I said, there was soldering. Some people reported that may have been a soldering issue. People could either see what looked like poor solder joints, so they were able to move the pixel and it worked again. Some people, when testing for the soft epoxy issues, meaning they were digging into the epoxy to prove it was soft and malleable, they could pick off the epoxy, and the parts that are supposed to be on the circuit board would come off with the epoxy and not stay on the circuit board, which to me means that does actually sort of lend to a possible soldering issue where they weren't soldered well to the circuit board. But a soldering issue is very hard to track or verify because that's not something everyone can spot like they can spot cracks in epoxy. So let's wrap up the survey a bit. Fires and dead pixels seem to be unrelated. Maybe not, but that's my theory. Other people may disagree. Maybe the cracking, failing epoxy, letting the water in causes corrosion, causes the fires, and it's not just the regulators causing the fire. That there is some validity to that. I just don't think it's likely. I will argue that 2020 was probably an unusually high year for failures, but overall those failures are small. Remember, we only had 128 people take the survey. I know people were already commenting they didn't take the survey and had failures, so there is an unknown margin of people that had failures that we don't quantify, but I still think it's a very small percentage of what actually is out there. So I don't want everyone doomed and gloomed. If these were truly single batch issues from pixels, that batch may have been only sold in the period of a week. I don't know. I asked both vendors to try to give me some idea of how long that batch could have been sold, and neither would answer that. Both vendors we talked to do acknowledge the epoxy issue in some way, which kind of, validates our theory that it's an epoxy issue, which, to be honest, with all those pictures was pretty obvious. There was no direct acknowledgement of a fire issue or what caused it, but again, he made a comment on regulated pixels that to me doesn't make any engineering sense. But we're not done yet. I still have 10 more slides. Oh, fun. At least I get done in maybe an hour. Oh, my favorite myth. All pixels come from the same factory, so there's no reason to buy from a US vendor. I have seen so many versions of this in comments on Facebook, and it drives me insane. This is false. Needs context. There are several factories, and even if there weren't, the same factory was able to produce different qualities depending on the customer's orders. Factories can make crap, factories can make gold, all about what the customer is willing to pay and what they're asking for in the assembly of their product. AKA, the customer of the factory has control over the quality of the product made. So even if it was all one factory, when you're picking your vendor, you're picking both that factory and the person controlling the quality that factory uses when making a product. It could be the same entity, it could be a reseller, or it could be a seller who works at the factory, but I'd argue most vendors are not factories. There's probably, I've talked to people that have been in there and they think there's about 3 to 4 factories maybe. But again, it could be the same factory, but when you're picking your vendor, you're picking someone who's inputting an order to that factory to meet certain specifications. So that's why the context of this myth that there's no reason to buy from US vendors is false in my mind. How do I know this? Well, I talk to my vendors. Have you guys talked to your vendors? I recommend talking to vendors. Most are pretty nice usually. The 2 vendors that I've talked to a lot that have been with me for most of my years in this community, the first one is Todd, DIY LED Express. He used to hang out in the forum chat rooms back in the forum days before Facebook even took off. And he would vent to me and tell me stories about his manufacturer would try and sell him in cost reduction options, and that he declined because he felt it was cutting corners, or how he'd get pixels that he would spot test, and the spot test would show failures, so he'd just eat the cost of those failures and not send those pixels out. The other person who I knew before he was a vendor, because he frequents expos and has other events, I've talked to him a lot too, just even before this whole issue came about. He tries to visit his factory that he uses annually in person, just to keep a good relationship with the factory. He also sets rules with them, including that they aren't allowed to make changes to the materials used in the pixels made for him without his consent. So yeah, all pixels come from China, but who's setting the bar for the quality of the materials used in your pixels? Now, I'm not saying those are the only 2 vendors that do this. I'm sure a lot of them do it. Those are just the 2 I know because I've talked to them. So I'm saying you should ask your vendor what they do. Ask them to, and make a case for what their value added to get your money is. And to be honest, I would argue that American vendors should do a better job at selling themselves and explaining this value added. Why do you pay more for an American vendor? Because it's someone that you can talk to who's controlling the factory, who's maintaining a level of quality, and is a lot easier to get a hold of when you have a problem. So I'm just trying to kill this myth because it's a big myth. All pixels from the same factory, so there's no reason to buy from a US vendor, to me is false for all those reasons. I also want to remind everyone, the world is buyer beware by default. I had a couple people give me the attitude that just because they can spend the money, they have the right to get a working product. And I call that the Amazon effect. This isn't Amazon. You shouldn't expect good customer return policy and customer support from everyone you can possibly get money from. I mean, there's that weird Wish app that I hear is just terrible. There are ways you can spend money on bad stuff and get bad stuff, and you don't have the right for that stuff to work. You have your own responsibility to make your purchasing decisions. You should do your own research, probably off Facebook. You should ask the vendors what value they add. You shouldn't even take my word on it. You should do your own research. You're responsible for your purchasing decisions. Personal responsibility. Another note. I'm almost done with notes, I promise, of lecturing. This is a plea. This is the plea that we shouldn't have had to done this. We have social media. We have the tools at our hands to be able to have discourse that could allow us to see something happened. What happened though is a lot of people came to me and they said, Bill, thank you for doing the survey, because I either made a post but then deleted it because of what happened, or I saw what happened in other people's posts and I decided not to make a post. And what they're saying is all these vendor fanboys would jump into their comments and it would just be a lot of noise of people arguing, fanboys back and forth and bad memes and things like that. That's all bad discourse. All that noise takes away from the actual discussion that could have happened on Facebook. We could have had people working together to figure out there was a statistical anomaly of certain vendors or certain pixels causing problems, had that noise not caused people to fear away from talking about it on Facebook. If that had happened, maybe we wouldn't have had to use this survey to put the picture together. Maybe we could have put the picture together on Facebook if we didn't have all these people that were being quote unquote vendor fanboys jumping in comment threads, contributing nothing of value to the discussion. Everyone should acknowledge. So don't be the I've used this vendor for years with no problems guy on posts of people sharing their experience. It takes away from the otherwise meaningful discourse on trying to figure out causes of failures. Everyone should know that vendors 99% of the time put out working product. That doesn't need to be reinforced every time someone says, hey, I bought these pixels from this vendor at this time and they're having problems. Does anyone else notice this? If the comments were just left to other people that had noticed it, we could have put this puzzle together much quicker without this extra work. But unfortunately, what we get is 1,000 people going, I use that vendor and I have no problems. I use that vendor and I have no problems. And it would elevate from there and people would literally delete their posts because they were tired of the discussion going that way. Without that noise, maybe the trends could have been better spotted without all this work. Oh, okay, I'm done with that one. All right, some good news to end on. We are improving. Boscoyo is switching to all Coro material to a new product that is more fire resistant. I'm going to say there was one last note on Ray's message. He says he's also looking into fire resistant epoxy for this year's pixels, even if it makes the pixels more costly. That was his quote. And to me, or to my epoxy expert, that should make it more expensive because the fire retardant epoxy is more expensive than regular epoxy. That's why all epoxy is not fire retardant. And then finally, here's a video that James sent me to show his new fireproof Coro. So here's a sample of old Coro and new Coro, both being lit by a blowtorch. All right, I'm seeing, this is actually into my presentation. I'm seeing Wally Lights posted that he has a page that explains his quality control. That's great. Thank you, Wally Lights, for explaining what a US vendor, what the value added for you is. Does there seem to be a difference in flammability of the epoxy in the various off-the-shelf regulated pixels out there at the moment too? So I didn't mention this, but I spent the night with Chris on the phone trying to set pixels on fire on purpose with a blowtorch. Some of the interesting things that it was actually Chris's idea. I actually couldn't get a lot of pixels to start on fire at all until I whacked them with a hammer and they cracked, and then they would light off like a firework. And Chris had that idea because his argument was you need to get oxygen deeper into the epoxy on more surface area to get the right ratio to start a fire, and he was dead right. So to answer the question, is it different flammability in epoxies various off-the-shelf pixels? I can go back to my pixel expert or my epoxy expert and ask. I don't have a good answer for that. I think the it's complicated is probably an overall good answer for that question, just like it is for the other stuff we answered. Let's see, I'm trying to scroll.
Can I answer John Storm's question real quick?
Sure.
So the answer is no. They'll cover it based upon your insurance policy, but afterwards you will be canceled.
That would happen to you?
For people that
No.
Can't read the chat, can you read his question and then answer?
Oh, so John, let me go back to chat. John Storms asked specifically, if you have a fire, will your homeowner's insurance cover it? Yes, they will. They'll cover it, but you more than likely will be canceled afterwards. I personally did not submit my fire to my homeowner's insurance, so I don't have that, but I did. A good friend of mine does do insurance policies, and she told me straight up that I would have been canceled.
I would imagine that answer can vary depending on the location, depending on the actual insurance that you're holding. It's not like a one size fit all thing, but I would imagine that since it's not UL approved, that you're gonna lean on the side of it causing issues.
So there's an Alan H in here who sounds like another epoxy expert, and he had a long paragraph about how complicated epoxy is. And that's more or less what the other guy was telling me too. Epoxy is very complicated. It takes a lot of work, and that's probably one of the more expensive parts of the pixel itself. And like everything you listed in his comment, there's a lot to it.
There's a question from Facebook, in the Facebook chat that says, has anyone had the strips with pixels catch fire?
None were reported. People are asking, I have unopened boxes of X pixels. Should I contact them? I'd say you probably should. Just keep it short, say why you're concerned, and maybe just pull them out and test them before you even contact them, and maybe you'll just be fine. Oh, someone here is an insurance agent that could have answered that probably. It varies by company and varies by size. People asked about what's the types of pixel pushers. So the survey had a box for people to say what their pixel pusher was, and that they could type in what it was. But again, the percentage of people that answered yes to pixel pushers was like 5 or 6%. It was very low. So it was a good indication that pixel pushers had nothing to do with the failures. Someone private messaged me, is it possible that the softer epoxy is melting around a hot regulator and essentially becoming liquid? I think either epoxy would, if the regulator got white hot or almost white hot, to me, I think good or weak epoxy would have melted around that. But the epoxy guy in here could probably clarify that if it's getting several hundred degrees in that little regulator, which I think it is, I think either epoxy would have failed. Someone reposted Alan. Yep, Alan sounds like a good guy. I almost want to talk to him later. Someone reported they did have a melting strip, but it was not on fire, just melting. So I guess that once someone did melt. The vendors
Another
that I
question
listed,
from Facebook.
Okay, good.
I'm sorry, Bill. I've heard of people who use burn-in. Do you have any recommendations on testing or burn-in?
Spiker would tell you to burn in. I don't. To me,
I won't tell you. I will say it. It's worthless.
Oh, okay. Spiker changed his mind. I guess fire will do that to you.
Yeah. So to answer that question, all of my pixels were burned in for 24 hours at basically 100% white. It ran on my house for 6 weeks without a problem. New Year's Eve is when it caught on fire. So no, it's useless. If it's going to burn out, it's going to burn out right away.
All the vendors whose names I listed except Paul. I technically didn't go to Paul directly, but I went. Michael RGB Man, was comfortable commenting on behalf of Paul for me. So the two vendors I spoke to and showed this data to were Ray and RGB Man. Should a vendor like Paul or Ray replace all the defective pixels? That's up to you. I'm not going to pass comment on that. I don't really know what your failure rate was, how long a customer you've been. I don't want to get into the what is good customer service game. This whole presentation and survey was trying to find, engineering reasons why we had failures, not judge vendors on their response to them. That reminds me, I should have had a slide in here and highlighted. We had a comments box that just said, whatever comment you'd like to put on the survey, please put. Anyone that felt the need to tell me about their customer service experience with the vendor was mostly positive. We got a lot of people saying, this vendor did replace them all, or when I contacted this vendor that took care of me. I have a good heart that we got more positive comments, even though we didn't ask for them in the survey responses than we got negative ones. I got some pixels that looked like they were low in epoxy. I put liquid tape in them, never had any issues. That sounds like you had Paul's pixels from RGB Man, because that's kind of what one of the ways he was describing his epoxy issues with. More insurance questions that really I don't have the ability to answer. Oh, Alan said, I'm Alan Hansen from Hansen Electronics. Hi, Alan Hansen. I've used epoxy myself for over 20 years and it's awful stuff. No idea what epoxy, if any, pixel suppliers are using. Yeah, neither did the epoxy. So the epoxy guy I talked to owns a epoxy potting business in the US. If customers come to him with assemblies, he recommends solutions, literally, and he gets the customer's products potted for him. And he said, there's so many epoxies out there, and these guys are actually probably going to, the cheapest Chinese epoxy houses in China that don't even sell it. They just make it really cheap for anyone making stuff in China. Is what his theory was for where this epoxy is coming from. Because when he saw what pixel prices were, he's like, I could never get that close to anything that cheap.
Ramon, you've got your hand up. You can go ahead and ask.
Did you turn on unmuting? Because a number of people can't unmute.
Yeah, everybody's muted, and so I just asked them to unmute. Go ahead.
I think I hit that button on accident trying to get to the chat. I apologize. But great presentation, Bill. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Maybe everyone won't hate me now. Could the capacitors around the regulator be the cause and not the regulator? Maybe. There's some thought that maybe there's some oscillations going on. That there were some claims that some of Ray's pixels omitted those capacitors, but everyone I asked for pictures of their Ray's pixels from last year had the capacitors. So I cannot substantiate what I heard of that Ray was omitting parts, because I never actually saw it myself. But whether or not those capacitors are the failure point and they cause the regulator, I still think it's the regulator actually heating up. It was an internal fault for the regulator of the capacitors. That's an interesting theory. I don't really have a way to tell you yes or no.
So Bill, is there a second part to the presentation? I know Dave Peace had a group that was set up.
I'm losing behind in comments. Maybe we should move to that. So.
Yeah, let's move forward, and then we can come back and address anything else. Okay.
Sorry about that, Ed.
No problem.
So Peace, you're up.
All right. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, no, that was excellent. Excellent presentation. Thank you for putting that together. So quite serendipitously, I had put this video out saying, hey, we as consumers need to band together so that we can ensure quality and safety of pixels moving forward. Kind of at the same time that Bill was putting this survey together. The good news is that kind of combined effort really, I think, lit a fire under lots of people to say, yeah, what can we do as consumers to make sure this, is resolved and, continues to not be an issue moving forward. So the nice thing about Bill's survey is that it captured all this data and that we were able to find commonalities and trends and identify where issues might have come sourced. So the issue now is going forward, how do we track this? How do we make sure that if there's large scale issues, again, that we can track them, we can identify them early, and we can notify the greater public or talk to the vendors for a response if there is an issue that is happening. So I called for some volunteers. We have about 75 people in this. It's a consumer advocacy group, and we just put up a website called pixel.report. And what this site is for is basically so that we can ensure that we're having quality and safety in our pixels moving forward. So you go to pixel.report, and there's two primary goals of this website. Number one is education. As Bill said, you know, there's certainly manufacturer side to this. There's certainly a consumer side to it as well. It could be user error. It could be, you know, we push our systems quite dramatically. But as he pointed out, 2020 was pretty excessive in the failures. So how can we find these issues quickly and respond to them quickly? So number one is education, getting people to stop asking the question, where can I find the cheapest pixel? Who has the best deals? That, you know, everybody on this call, I'd kind of encourage you, when you see that question, to respond with, do not look for the cheapest price. When you're talking about the price of these light shows that we're putting together, we're already spending a bundle of money. The difference between a risk and, you know, potentially a safer option or a less risky option is really not a huge price difference. So I'd implore everybody to help guide this conversation away from the cheapest pixel.
Hey, David, can I add one thing to that?
Sure.
Our pixels are what, you know, our audience sees, and they are a big expense to our overall display. But the fact of the matter is they're a small percentage of our overall cost. So when you're looking at the cost of your display and the setup and the infrastructure and everything else, the pixel is what is driving lights and power. The other things behind it really need to be taken into consideration, and this is where you should not cheap out. And I think number one is the most important thing. Don't cheap out.
Totally agree. Totally agree. And it's a common place for people to start, right? Is where's the best deal? And we can all do our part in guiding people away from just trying to find the cheapest thing. So look for a vendor, you know, number two here, look for a vendor that has a strong history selling pixels in the hobby, and that's well known. And number three here, this is, you know, we're not saying don't buy from China, but be cautious when buying directly from China, because if there is a problem, especially if you have a large quantity of pixels, you're going to have less recourse if there's an issue. You know, buying from US resellers, trusted resellers here, stateside, you're going to be more protected if there are issues. And plus, you're going to be able to have recourse if it does come to that. But, you know, typically those issues are fewer because these vendors, as much as possible, you know, as Bill said, try to maintain very, very strong quality. So. Number four, do not pay with PayPal friends and family. Again, this is just a suggestion, right? It's for protection. It's if somebody's offering, hey, a discount with PayPal friends and family, that's great. The problem is that you have to pay from your bank account. You can't do a chargeback on the credit card if there is an issue. You lose, again, recourse with PayPal. They can't do anything in regards to that transaction. So if there is an issue, you kind of lose recourse there. So definitely keep that in mind. So the big thing here is, you know, we do want to see a shift. And the only way we can have a shift is if consumers demand a change. And so what does the consumer need? Well, we want to have confidence in our lights, right? We want to have confidence that they're going to be safe and they're going to be quality. So the only way we can have that confidence is to have people report when there's issues over time so that we can see if there's trends. So this is what we're asking of pixel vendors to, again, to increase the visibility and the ease of us to be able to find issues, and for us to just, again, maintain that the quality is a high concern and a high importance. So number one, this is something new. Pixel strings should have a conspicuous lot number or date of manufacture printed on the wire PC or affixed with a tag. One of the problems is, if you're like me, I have pixels from all sorts of vendors from all sorts of years. I have no way of identifying what came from what or when. So if there was an issue, you know, unless it was something recent, I wouldn't really be able to tell you where it came from, who it came from. So we need to be able to track these down at the individual string level to see where they came from and when they were manufactured. So if we do find trends, we can identify lot numbers and groups. Just a general note here, you know, pixels should not have a failure rate greater than 1 pixel in 1,000. You know, as Bill said, people were submitting things with like 0.1%. You know, or excuse me, lower than 1.1%. Yeah, 1 in 1,000 is or less. That's perfectly normal. It's perfectly fine. They could happen at the beginning. They could happen during the season. So during the season, that's kind of a normal failure rate. But number 3 is pixels just should not catch fire. There's certainly a lot of personal responsibility that has to happen, but the manufacturer of those pixels needs to be very conscientious of pixels, or excuse me, of the build of those pixels and ensure that they don't catch fire. And if they do, again, we want them to be reported so that we can track them and understand if there's a specific lot that's affected. Number 4, when possible, fire-resistant materials should be used. Again, I think that Ray is already moving towards that. They may be more expensive, but again, hopefully, you know, that's a Band-Aid a bit, you know, it's a bit a safety measure, which is great, but we don't want pixels to catch on fire, period. But fire-resistant material certainly does help. Provide more honesty and transparency with regards to true wire gauge. Again, this has nothing to do with the failures necessarily. And I think we're all very, very clear that the wire gauge that are reported are not accurate, but we do want to make sure that those are getting communicated a little bit more accurately. And then finally, just responding to issues in a timely manner and performing a root cause analysis to widespread issues. I loved what Ray responded with his root cause analysis of the epoxy. You know, having that level of transparency is going to be critical for people to gain confidence, because if there's a problem, I want to know that the vendor has identified the issue, they have fixed the issue, and it's no longer going to be an issue. I always say this, a person, a company, anything, they are not judged by the fact that they have problems. We all have problems, we all have issues. They are judged by how they respond to those problems. So if Ray has a fire issue and he says, look, I had a fire issue, I've responded to it, here's why it happened, I've fixed it, that's great, and that's fine. We want that transparency, and then people will build that confidence to buy from that person again. So again, this site is going to list the vendors that you know, we as a community feel maintain these recommendations. We don't have them listed yet, but we are asking that the vendors are going to submit requests to be added, and then identifying which of those features they are supporting or going to support. And then, but most critically, most important is really for us as a community to continue the feedback loop. You know, there was some comments in there saying, well, we should have a continuous survey. This is basically Bill's survey, just it's going to be carried on ad infinitum, so that we can, again, if there's issues that are identified, we can jump on them quickly. This is not a vendor bashing thing. This is not a vendor promotion thing. This is an information thing. So there's already been a great response to this. And it's awesome to see, because you saw Boscoyo with the fire retardant Coro. Gilbert Engineering is coming out with the same thing. The fire resistant epoxy. I mean, you just look at how there's already been a big shift in response to this, and I just expect it to get better and better, which we're all going to benefit from, so which is great. So if people have issues in the forums, send it a Pixel Report so they can submit the issue. I am not monitoring this. There's a separate group headed up by John Spiker that's going to be reviewing reports for validity, and again, not for bashing. As Bill said, there needs to be some level of review to make sure that this isn't just you know, people submitting a bunch of things to bash, but then to see those reports and then draw some conclusions, and then see if there is a wider issue that needs to be communicated out to the vendors of a wider spread issue. So yeah, that's it from my side. I think, again, going forward, if we can just be very, very vigilant about reporting issues, I think we will be able to identify issues quicker, hold the vendors and the resellers and the manufacturers to account for quality, and it's just going to elevate the hobby even more. So.
Thank you guys for a really great presentation. If there are any other questions, we'll address them after the recording and after announcements.
The xLights project exists because of people like you. Help continue the project by making a donation today at xlights.org/donate.